there, COM 110 students. This is our final chapter. Woohoo! Chapter 12 is about interpersonal power and influence. We all would like to be more powerful and have more influence, but we also need to understand how power can be misused and how it functions in our relationships. So let's start by taking a look at the principles of power and influence. We have to first understand what power is. And power is the ability to influence another person, how they think and what they do. Oftentimes, we can influence the thoughts that somebody has about current events, about our relationship, about work-related issues. We can also influence their behaviors or what they do. So if we want a spouse to drink less, we can try to exert our power to help them do that. If we'd like our spouse to lose weight so they would be more attractive to us, we can use power to get them to do that. We often use power with our children, trying to get them to follow rules or change behaviors that we feel are detrimental to their growth. The other thing that we must keep in mind is power is asymmetrical. That means when one person has power, the other person does not. It's very rare that both people in a relationship or in a dyad, which is just two people, can have the same amount of power. Somebody's always going to have a little bit more and a little bit less. We do want that in our interpersonal relationships to be minimal. We don't want it to be significant. But think about in the workplace, you may have a manager and a subordinate, and there's a very large difference in the amount of power. So the manager has extreme power, and that worker has very little power. So there's times when the distance, what we call power distance, if you remember from chapter 2, power distance between two people is drastically different. In workplace situations, in parenting, that's okay. But in our romantic relationships, we want that power distance to be much less. So, the principles of power are as follows. Some people are more powerful than others. That means that people are not born equally into power. Some people are wealthier than other people. Wealthier people have more power than people that don't because they have the money to do what they want to do and influence other people and get what they want. People who are more attractive have more power because people like to be attractive. They like to be with attractive people. And so they may tend to have people go over and above in terms of what they do to that person for that person because they're so attractive. So attractive people, especially in a relationship, you'll see sometimes, let's say a man who may not be very attractive, but his wife is extremely attractive, and you can see how she kind of really calls the shots because she's so much more attractive, and he is so taken by her attractiveness that she can get him to do whatever she wants. The other thing is physical strength. Obviously, that's going to play an issue. I think that it plays less of an issue in marriages, but sometimes, especially in relationships that tend to be on the more dysfunctional side and maybe there's airs or hints of violence, obviously the man, because he's stronger, is going to have a little bit more power, and that woman is fearful of what he could do. The next thing we need to know is some people are born to power and some people learn to acquire it. Some people, again, they're born wealthy. Other people, like Steve Jobs, somebody who didn't have a lot of money, he actually increased his power by coming up with ideas that were cutting edge, bringing those ideas to fruition, and continuing to be on the cutting edge of electronic devices. So he learned to acquire power. He wasn't born into it. Power is connected to violence, as I said before. We sometimes can see the tendency for a woman who's in a violent marriage to be fearful of her husband because of his physical strength. But usually husbands that are violent They're violent because they feel like they can't control that other person, or they don't know how to control that other person, or they don't know how to empower that other person. And so what you see is a husband becomes physically abusive because he doesn't know the other techniques that he can use in order to share power or influence his wife to do certain things. And it's okay to influence people to do certain things. For example, if I want to get into shape and I keep complaining about my my lack of muscle tone, my husband may then try to exert his power to show me the ways that I could do that by raising my self-esteem about it. He may be positive about it, or he may share some of the skills that he's seen happen. So then that power then is something that I get to share in. And that leads us to that second principle, which is power can be shared. And so when you have a relationship in which, let's say a husband, we'll put power on a continuum. So power's on a continuum from 1 to 10. 10 means the person has ultimate power, and 1 means they have no power at all. As I said, in a workplace, that might be okay. The problem is that worker that has a 1 is going to be much less effective unless you begin to empower them. And the ways that you can do that is to raise their self-esteem, make them think that they are a capable person, be open with them, give positive feedback, be empathetic, so be understanding, and then support them in new ventures that they may want to do. Allow them the opportunity to make their own decisions, and then share some of, maybe as a manager, the skills that you have that coworker or that lower level worker doesn't have, so that they can then begin to have that same amount of power. But those same 3 things can be done in a marriage. And it's important that if you see or you sense in a marriage or any type of romantic relationship that you are always trying to empower the other person by doing these 3 things on the bottom of this slide. All right, the third principle of power is that power can be increased or decreased. I think we said that before, that you can improve your power. You can learn better communication skills, better ways of negotiating, or you can lose power by trying to control others. Oftentimes, you'll see parents who threaten their children, if you don't turn that TV off right now, you are not going to watch it the rest of the week. And then the child doesn't do it, the parent walks over angrily, flips it off, and then we find that child watching TV the very next day. And that allows that child to gain power, but the parent will lose power because they're not following through with those threats. And they're trying to control that child instead of teaching them maybe ways that they can communicate when they're being told to do something and they don't want to. Also, if you allow yourself to be controlled and you don't confront the person that is controlling you, you are going to lose power. The other way that you can lose power is to use profanity. So you want to, at all times, avoid profanity, not because of any religious undertones that it may have or any church-related rules that you have to follow, simply because when you start to curse, you lose power. And we all want power. So if you can just make that simple change when you're interacting with somebody that you care for or that is part of a relationship that is helpful to you, you need to refrain from using any profanity. The fourth principle is that power follows the principle of less interest. And I know that's a little confusing, but what it means is the person with less vested interest in the relationship has more power. So if one person would be devastated if the relationship ended, they're going to have less power, especially if the other person is like, I like this person, but if things came to an end, it would be okay. The person that has that attitude of, well, if it comes to an end, that will be okay, they're going to have more power because they're less dependent on the rewards and the punishments that the other person will give. Number 5, fifth principle, power generates privilege. So when we have more power, we have certain privileges. Now, the first two, I'm going to use examples from the business world because I don't know that they apply as much to romantic relationships, although I think the second one might. But the first one, territorial encroachment, means this. If you have a supervisor who has their own office and you and your coworkers are in cubicles, think about how if you go to your manager's office, you have to knock on the door, right? But your manager can simply walk right into your cubicle when they want to talk to you, and they don't ever have to knock on a door or ask to come in where you may have to. So the person with more power, they're enabled to just encroach on your territory, just kind of walk right up to you without having any sort of entrance or having to knock on a door or ask permission. Power also generates privilege when it comes to touch. Think about how a doctor can comfort you and they can maybe hug you or put their arm around you, but you would never do that to a doctor. They're really have the power in that situation, and so they're touching, but you're not reciprocating that touch. Same thing applies in workplace situations. Sometimes you may have a manager, let's say a female manager, who may pat her male coworkers on the back or even her female coworkers on the back or give them a little like side squeeze, you know, that professional hug, which is a side squeeze, not a full front body hug, because those are a little bit creepy in a business setting. They're allowed to do that, but the subordinates or the coworkers can't do it to the manager because they don't have the same amount of power. Now, we're not talking about inappropriate touch. We'll get to that later on when we talk about sexual harassment. We're just talking about kind of that communicative touch that, hey, I value you and you're doing a good job. Power generates privilege when it comes to having the final word in an argument. The person with more power in a relationship, they tend to be the winner in arguments. And remember, we don't want to be the winner in an argument. We want both parties to win. But sometimes that person who always seems to get that final word, the last say, they have more power. And we want to have that be a red flag so that we can see if they're always getting the last word, that final word, we need to somehow move together on that power continuum so that that person who's getting the last word has a little bit less power and you have more power. So it's important to move towards the middle, decrease that power distance. The final thing, when you have power, you get to break the rules without consequences. For example, husband and wife is a good situation, and let's say, and I shouldn't always use that, so we'll say we have a romantic relationship and one person works and the other person stays home. And the person that works is allowed to come home, let's say an hour late, because work is kind of unpredictable and you never know, when they're going to get out or if there's going to be a late meeting. And so they're allowed to come home late. But that person that stays at home, let's say they end up going out on the weekend with some friends and they come home an hour late, and it's a big deal because they broke the rule of the relationship that you should be punctual. When somebody's waiting for you to come home, you should be punctual. But the partner that's out working and making all the money, they can come home late, break that rule without a consequence. But when that other person that's not working stays out late and they come home late and they break that rule, there's a big consequence. There's an argument that takes place, and maybe there's some silencing techniques as the week progresses, and just some nastiness between the two. So again, it's the breaking a rule, and there's really not a big consequence to it. They can break the rules, but you can't. That's a signal that the power distance needs to be reduced. The absolute final principle that we have today is power has a cultural dimension. Power distance. We've been talking about this the whole time, so back to that continuum. Think about if on that continuum you are looking at the United States. So in the United States culture, let's say men on the power continuum, because still more of them are earning more than women, they have a 7 on the continuum, but women have a 6. Now, there's some households where if the women are making more money or one partner's making more money, they're going to be higher on that spectrum. So the one who's making more money is going to be higher. So let's give them an 8. The person that's not earning as much money may be a 6, but that's still only 2 points off the scale. Well, let's think about the Middle East. Men have a power of 10 and women have a power of 1, right? Countries where they have to wear the burqa, they can't expose their face. That's a huge power distance in that culture. North Korea, huge power distance in that culture. And I have tied most of this to gender because gender is such a cultural influence. And Middle Eastern men, they're given the opportunity to be educated where women are not. So of course the men have more power because education is power, and that's why women aren't allowed to go to school, because they don't want them to share in that power. They want that power distance to remain significant in certain relationships. So there you go. Those are the 6 principles. I'll be back with the next video, which is relationship, person, and message power.